The scream that tore through the mountain silence sent Jacob Thornton bolting upright in his bed, his heart hammering against his ribs like a war drum as the November wind howled outside their cabin in the Colorado Rockies. "Jacob!" Sarah's voice cut through the darkness, sharp with pain and fear, and he was beside her in an instant, his calloused hands finding hers in the dim glow of the dying embers in the fireplace. "I'm here, darling. I'm right here." His deep voice was steady despite the terror coursing through his veins. He'd faced down grizzly bears, survived blizzards that would kill lesser men, and fought off claim jumpers with nothing but his bare hands and a hunting knife. But nothing had ever frightened him like the sound of his wife in pain. Sarah gripped his hand so hard he felt his bones grind together, her face pale and slick with sweat, even in the cold November air of 1876. "The baby!" she gasped between clenched teeth. "It's coming! It's too early, Jacob! It's too early!" Jacob's mind raced as he lit the oil lamp with shaking hands, flooding their small cabin with golden light. They weren't expecting their first child for another 3 weeks. He'd planned to take Sarah down to Denver before her time came, to the real doctor with the proper hospital. But the early snows had come and blocked the passes 2 weeks ago. They'd been snowed in at their cabin, 15 miles from the nearest town of Cedar Ridge, population 243 souls. "How long have you been feeling the pains?" He smoothed her dark hair back from her forehead, his rough fingers gentle despite their size. Jacob was a mountain of a man, standing 6'4" with shoulders broad enough to carry a full-grown elk, arms thick with muscle from years of chopping wood and hauling supplies through the wilderness. His sandy brown hair fell past his shoulders, tied back with a leather cord, and his steel-gray eyes held a fierce intelligence that belied his isolated existence. "Since midnight," Sarah admitted, her brown eyes meeting his with a mixture of fear and determination. "I thought they were just the false pains the midwife in town told me about, but they're getting closer together. Much closer." Jacob glanced at the window where the first hints of dawn were still hours away. It was 3 a.m. by his pocket watch, the one his father had given him before he'd headed west to make his fortune in the Colorado mountains. He'd found that fortune in silver and pelts, but his real treasure had walked into his life 18 months ago when Sarah Crawford had arrived in Cedar Ridge as the new schoolteacher. He'd gone into town for supplies that crisp spring morning in 1875, and there she'd been, standing outside the general store with 2 carpet bags and a trunk, her dark hair pinned up beneath a sensible bonnet, her brown eyes taking in the rough mountain town with a mixture of apprehension and excitement. She'd been looking for directions to the schoolhouse, and Jacob, who rarely spoke more than 10 words to anyone, had found himself offering to carry her bags and show her the way. That 10-minute walk had changed his life forever. Sarah had been 22 years old, fresh from a teaching college in Boston, full of dreams about bringing education to the frontier. Jacob had been 28, already wealthy by mountain standards, but living alone in his cabin with only his thoughts and the wilderness for company. He'd been content with that life until Sarah smiled at him and asked if he might know any children who needed schooling. Within a month, he'd been riding into town every Saturday just to see her. Within 3 months, he'd been courting her properly, bringing her wildflowers and fresh game, fixing the leaks in the schoolhouse roof, and sitting through her readings of poetry, even though he'd never been much for books. Within 6 months, he'd asked her to marry him. Terrified, she'd laugh at the idea of binding herself to a rough mountain man who still had dirt under his fingernails and calluses on his hands. But Sarah hadn't laughed. She'd said yes with tears in her eyes and kissed him in front of half the town, scandalizing the more proper ladies and making Jacob feel like the luckiest man alive. They'd married in August of 1875, and Sarah had left her teaching position to move up to his cabin in the high country. She'd taken to mountain life with a courage and grace that made him fall more in love with her every single day. Now, as another contraction seized her, Jacob made his decision. "I'm going for Dr. Morrison." "You can't." Sarah's grip on his hand tightened impossibly. "The snow, Jacob. You'll never make it to Cedar Ridge and back in time. The trail is too dangerous at night." "I've ridden that trail in worse conditions." It wasn't quite true, but he'd be damned if he'd let fear stop him from getting help for his wife. "Morrison will know what to do. He delivered half the babies in town." "There isn't time." Sarah's voice rose with panic as another pain gripped her. "Jacob, please don't leave me alone." He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips, trying to pour all his love and reassurance into the gesture. "I'll be back before dawn with the doctor. I swear it on my life. But I need you to be strong for me, for our baby. Can you do that?" Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Please hurry." Jacob dressed in record time, pulling on his warmest clothes, his heavy coat, his boots lined with rabbit fur. He grabbed his rifle, not because he expected trouble from men, but because the mountain lions and wolves were bold in winter. He stoked the fire until it roared, making sure Sarah would stay warm, and left her with water and towels within reach. "I love you more than life itself," he told her, kneeling beside the bed one more time. "You're the strongest woman I've ever known. You can do this." "I love you too." Sarah's smile was brave even through her pain. "Ride fast." Jacob burst out of the cabin into the biting November night. Snow lay thick on the ground, and more was falling in fat, heavy flakes that caught in his hair and beard. The temperature had to be well below freezing, and the wind cut through even his heavy coat like a knife. He ran to the small barn beside the cabin where he kept his 3 horses. He'd normally take Samson, his steady gelding, but tonight he needed speed more than anything else. Thunder was his wildest horse, a black stallion with a white blaze on his forehead and a temperament to match his name. Jacob had won him in a poker game 2 years ago from a man who'd claimed the horse was unbreakable. It had taken Jacob 3 months of patient work to earn Thunder's trust, but now the stallion would run through hellfire for him. "Need you to be fast tonight, boy," Jacob murmured as he saddled Thunder with practiced efficiency. The horse snorted and stamped, sensing the urgency in Jacob's movements. "Sarah needs us. Our baby needs us." Within minutes, they were flying down the mountain trail, snow kicking up behind them in white clouds. The moon was nearly full, providing just enough light to see by when the clouds parted. Jacob knew every twist and turn of this path, every treacherous drop-off and switchback. He'd ridden it hundreds of times in all weather, bringing supplies up and pelts down, but never with this kind of desperate urgency driving him forward. Thunder's hooves pounded against the frozen ground, his breath coming in great steaming clouds. Jacob leaned low over the stallion's neck, urging him faster, faster, always faster. Every minute that passed was another minute Sarah was alone and in pain. Every delay could mean the difference between life and death for his wife, his child, or both. The trail wound down through stands of pine and aspen, across frozen streams where Thunder's hooves rang against the ice, past rocky outcroppings where the wind howled like a living thing. Jacob's face went numb with cold, and ice formed in his beard, but he didn't slow down. He couldn't slow down. Halfway to town, disaster nearly struck. A branch, heavy with snow and weakened by the wind, came crashing down directly in their path. Thunder reared with a scream of fear, his front hooves pawing the air. Jacob held on with iron thighs and strong hands, using every bit of his horsemanship to keep from being thrown. If he fell here, if he broke a leg or worse, Sarah would be alone. The thought gave him superhuman strength, and he managed to calm Thunder and guide him around the fallen branch. "Good boy," he praised, patting the stallion's neck with a shaking hand. "Good boy, we keep going." They pressed on through the darkness and the snow. Jacob's thoughts raced faster than Thunder's hooves. What if something went wrong? What if the baby came before he got back? What if Sarah hemorrhaged or the baby was breech? He knew the basics of birthing animals, had helped deliver foals and calves, but this was different. This was Sarah, his whole world, his reason for waking up every morning with a smile instead of just going through the motions of survival. He'd never imagined he could love someone the way he loved Sarah. Before her, his life had been simple and solitary. He'd come west after the Civil War, unable to settle back into normal life after the horrors he'd witnessed. The mountains had been his refuge, a place where the only battles were against nature and the elements, clean and honest struggles without the moral ambiguity of war. But Sarah had awakened something in him he'd thought died on the battlefields of Virginia. She'd made him want to build something instead of just surviving. She'd made him dream of a family, of children running through the meadow behind their cabin, of growing old together, watching the seasons change in the high country. The lights of Cedar Ridge finally appeared through the snow like a miracle. Jacob pushed Thunder harder for the final stretch, racing down the main street past the saloon, where light and music still spilled out despite the late hour, past the general store and the church and the schoolhouse where he'd first realized he was falling in love. Dr. Morrison's house sat at the end of the street, a neat white building with a shingle hanging outside that read, Nathaniel Morrison, M.D. Jacob leaped off Thunder before the horse had fully stopped, taking the porch steps 3 at a time and pounding on the door hard enough to rattle the windows. Dr. Morrison! Dr. Morrison, open up! It took only a moment before the door swung open to reveal the doctor in his nightshirt and robe, a lamp in his hand, and sleep still clinging to his eyes. Morrison was in his 50s, a compact man with gray hair and steady hands that had guided countless babies into the world. Jacob Thornton? Morrison's confusion cleared instantly when he saw the desperation on Jacob's face. Is it Sarah? Is it the baby? Yes. The pains started at midnight. They're coming fast and she's 3 weeks early. Doctor, please, I need you to come now. Morrison was already moving, calling instructions over his shoulder to his wife, who'd appeared at the top of the stairs. I'll be back when I can, Judith. Don't wait up. Within 5 minutes, that felt like 5 hours. Morrison was dressed and had his medical bag packed. But when they stepped outside, the doctor stopped short at the sight of Thunder, still breathing hard from the frantic ride. Jacob, your horse is exhausted. He'll never make it back up the mountain, not carrying 2 men in these conditions. He has to. Jacob's voice was iron. We don't have a choice. We do have a choice. Morrison grabbed Jacob's arm. My horse is fresh. We'll take 2 horses. It'll be slower, but we'll both get there alive, and that's what Sarah needs. Jacob wanted to argue, wanted to demand they leave immediately, but the logic was sound. He forced himself to nod and help Morrison saddle his bay mare, while Thunder was led to Morrison's small barn to rest and drink. The ride back up the mountain was agonizing. Morrison's mare was steady, but nowhere near as fast as Thunder, and the doctor himself was a competent but not exceptional rider. Jacob had to force himself to match Morrison's pace instead of racing ahead, reminding himself over and over that arriving with the doctor was worth the extra time. They rode through the pre-dawn darkness as the snow continued to fall. Morrison asked questions about Sarah's condition, about how far apart the contractions had been, about whether her water had broken. Jacob answered as best he could, but there was so much he didn't know, so much that could have happened in the hours since he'd left. Sarah's a strong woman, Morrison said as they climbed higher into the mountains. I've seen her around town. She's got the kind of spirit that doesn't give up easily, and first babies usually take their time. Chances are good we'll get there with plenty of time to spare. Jacob wanted to believe him, but the fear was a living thing in his chest, squeezing tighter with every passing minute. The sky was just beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn when they finally reached the cutoff to his cabin. The snow had stopped, and the world was silent, except for the sound of the horse's breathing and the creak of leather. Then, cutting through the stillness, came a sound that made Jacob's blood run cold, a baby's cry. No, Jacob breathed, kicking his borrowed horse into a gallop. No, no, no. He burst into the clearing around his cabin just as the sun broke over the eastern peaks, flooding the snow with golden light. Smoke rose from the chimney, and the cabin looked peaceful and normal. But that baby's cry continued, strong and insistent. Jacob practically fell off his horse, stumbling through the snow to the cabin door. He threw it open, terrified of what he might find. Sarah lay in their bed, pale but smiling, her hair plastered to her forehead with sweat, and in her arms, wrapped in one of Jacob's flannel shirts, was a tiny red-faced baby, wailing with impressive lung power. You're late, Sarah said, her voice exhausted but touched with humor. She couldn't wait for you. She? Jacob crossed the cabin in 3 strides, dropping to his knees beside the bed. We have a daughter? A very impatient daughter. Sarah shifted the bundle so Jacob could see the baby's scrunched-up face. She decided dawn was the perfect time to arrive. I'm sorry, Jacob. I tried to wait for you. Don't you dare apologize. Jacob's voice broke as he reached out with one massive trembling hand to touch his daughter's impossibly tiny fist. She immediately gripped his finger with surprising strength, and he felt his heart crack wide open with a love so fierce it almost hurt. You're both alive. You're both here. That's all that matters. Dr. Morrison came through the door, medical bag in hand, and quickly assessed the situation. Well now, looks like you managed just fine without me, Mrs. Thornton. But let me take a look at both of you just to make sure everything's as it should be. Jacob reluctantly moved aside, though he kept hold of his daughter's tiny hand while Morrison conducted his examination. The doctor worked efficiently, checking Sarah and then the baby with practiced thoroughness. Everything looks good, Morrison announced with a satisfied nod. The baby's small, as early babies tend to be, but she's breathing well and has a good, strong cry. Sarah, you did an excellent job under very difficult circumstances. I'm impressed. I didn't have much choice, Sarah said with a weak laugh. She was determined to be born, with or without help. Morrison turned to Jacob. You've got yourself a fighter there, Jacob. Both of them. They're going to be just fine. But I want to stay for a few hours just to make sure there are no complications. Jacob nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. He'd ridden all night, pushed Thunder to the limits of the horse's endurance, faced his worst fears on that desperate ride through the darkness. And he'd arrived to find that Sarah had done it all on her own, had brought their daughter into the world through sheer strength and courage while he was miles away. I'm sorry I wasn't here, he finally managed, sitting on the edge of the bed and gathering both Sarah and the baby into his arms as gently as his big hands would allow. I should have been here. You did exactly what you needed to do, Sarah said firmly, leaning her head against his chest. You went for help because you love us. That took just as much courage as anything I did, and you're here now, and that's what matters. The baby made a small, snuffling sound, and both parents looked down at her in wonder. She'd stopped crying and was blinking up at them with dark, unfocused eyes, her tiny mouth working as if she was trying to figure out this strange new world she'd entered. She needs a name, Sarah said softly. Jacob had thought about names for months, had debated and discussed with Sarah until they'd narrowed it down to a few choices for a boy and a few for a girl. But looking at his daughter now, held safe in the cabin he'd built with his own 2 hands, born at dawn after the longest night of his life, only one name felt right. Dawn, he said. Her name is Dawn, Dawn Crawford Thornton. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. Dawn. It's perfect. Dr. Morrison finished preparing a tonic for Sarah and left instructions for her care, then accepted Jacob's offer of breakfast before the long ride back to town. While the doctor ate the eggs and bacon Jacob prepared, Jacob couldn't stop staring at his wife and daughter, still half convinced he was dreaming. Sarah had managed to deliver the baby entirely on her own, in their cabin, with no help except her own determination and courage. The thought of what could have gone wrong made Jacob feel sick, but Sarah seemed remarkably calm about the whole ordeal. I was terrified, she admitted later, after Morrison had ridden back to Cedar Ridge and Jacob was sitting beside the bed holding Dawn while Sarah rested. When I realized there was no way you'd get back in time, I was so scared I could barely breathe. But then I felt her moving, and I thought about you riding through the night to bring help, and I knew I had to be brave. I couldn't give up. You're the bravest person I've ever known, Jacob said, his voice rough with emotion. I've seen soldiers in battle who didn't have half your courage. I was brave because of you, Sarah countered, because you gave me a reason to fight, because I knew you were coming back, and I wanted you to come home to both of us alive and well. Dawn squirmed in Jacob's arms, and he looked down at her in amazement. She was so small, barely the length of his forearm, and yet she was utterly perfect. 10 tiny fingers, 10 tiny toes, a dusting of dark hair on her head that looked like it might curl like Sarah's. She had Sarah's nose, he decided, but he couldn't tell yet who she'd take after in coloring or features. I can't believe we made her, he said in wonder. Sarah smiled. We did. She's ours, Jacob. Our daughter. Our family. Family. The word settled into Jacob's chest like a warm coal, spreading heat through his whole body. He had a family now, not just Sarah, though she would always be the center of his world, but a daughter to protect and raise and teach. A daughter who would learn to love these mountains the way he did, who would grow up strong and brave like her mother. The next few days passed in a blur of exhaustion and joy. Sarah recovered quickly, her youth and strength serving her well, though Dr. Morrison had warned them she needed to rest for at least 2 weeks before resuming any strenuous activity. Jacob threw himself into caring for both his wife and daughter with a devotion that made Sarah laugh even as tears of happiness ran down her cheeks. He learned to change Dawn's napkins, though his big hands fumbled with the pins at first. He learned to hold her properly, supporting her tiny head, and to rock her when she cried. He discovered that walking the length of the cabin while humming old war songs soothed her better than anything else, and he spent hours doing just that while Sarah slept or ate or simply sat watching them with a soft smile on her face. The snow continued to fall through November, piling up around the cabin until they were well and truly isolated from the outside world. But Jacob didn't mind. He had everything he needed right here within these log walls: his wife, his daughter, the supplies he'd put away for winter, and a love that filled every corner of the small space. On Dawn's 1-week birthday, as Jacob sat by the fire with his daughter sleeping on his chest, Sarah came to sit beside him. She looked better now, the color back in her cheeks and the exhaustion fading from her eyes. "I've been thinking," she said, leaning against his shoulder, "about next year, about the baby and the cabin and winter." Jacob felt a flutter of worry. "Are you unhappy here? Do you want to move to town?" "No." Sarah took his free hand, threading her fingers through his. "I love our cabin. I love our life here. But Dawn's birth made me realize how isolated we are. If something had gone really wrong, if there had been complications." "I know." Jacob had been having the same thoughts, though he hadn't wanted to voice them. "I've been thinking, too, about building a larger cabin, maybe closer to town, but still far enough to have privacy. Somewhere we could get to a doctor quicker if needed. Or," Sarah said slowly, "we could make friends with some of the other families who live in the high country. The Johnsons have that ranch about 8 miles east, and the McGuires are only 10 miles south. If we built relationships with them, if we knew we could count on them in an emergency and they could count on us." Jacob considered this. He'd always been a solitary man, preferring his own company to that of others. But he wasn't just Jacob anymore. He was a husband and a father with responsibilities that went beyond his own preferences. "That's a good idea," he said finally. "When spring comes and the pass is clear, we'll make the rounds, get to know the neighbors properly, build a community up here." Sarah kissed his cheek. "Thank you for being willing to change. I know it doesn't come naturally to you." "I'd do anything for you and Dawn," Jacob said simply. "Anything at all." As winter deepened, life in the cabin settled into a rhythm. Dawn grew stronger and more alert, her dark eyes beginning to focus on faces and follow movement. She started to smile at around 6 weeks, and the first time she smiled at Jacob, he felt like his heart might burst right out of his chest. Christmas came, and Jacob fashioned a small wooden rattle for Dawn, while Sarah sewed a tiny dress from fabric she'd brought from town. They celebrated quietly, just the 3 of them, singing carols by the fire and sharing a special dinner of roasted venison and wild berry pie. "This is the best Christmas I've ever had," Sarah said as they lay in bed that night, Dawn sleeping peacefully in the cradle Jacob had built and placed beside them. "Last Christmas we were newly married and so in love, and I thought nothing could be better. But this year, with Dawn here, with our little family complete, it's like every blessing I ever dreamed of has come true." "Complete for now," Jacob said, running his hand over Sarah's hair. "But maybe we'll have more someday. Maybe Dawn will have brothers and sisters." "Maybe," Sarah agreed sleepily, "but not for a while. I'd like to enjoy being a mother to one before we think about adding more." Jacob smiled in the darkness, holding his wife close while their daughter slept beside them. He thought back to that desperate night ride, the fear and terror that had driven him through the darkness and snow. He'd been prepared to face anything, do anything to bring help to Sarah. And though he'd arrived too late, though Dawn had been born without the doctor's assistance, everything had turned out right in the end. January brought the worst of the winter storms. Snow piled so high against the cabin walls that Jacob had to dig a path to the barn each morning just to feed the horses. But inside their home, warmth and love kept the cold at bay. Dawn was growing remarkably fast, filling out and becoming more alert and responsive. She would coo and gurgle when Jacob talked to her, and she'd begun to recognize his voice, turning her head toward him whenever he entered the room. By February, Dawn was 3 months old and had become the center of Jacob and Sarah's entire world. She was a happy baby, only crying when she was hungry or tired, and she seemed to love the sounds of the wilderness that filtered through the cabin walls. The howl of wolves would make her go quiet and still, as if she was listening intently. The call of an eagle would have her trying to turn her head toward the sound. "She's a mountain baby through and through," Sarah said with amusement one afternoon, as Jacob held Dawn up to the window to watch the snow fall. "I think she's got your wild heart, Jacob Thornton." "I hope she has your kind heart," Jacob replied, "and your courage and your beauty. She can leave the wild parts to her old father." Sarah laughed, coming to stand beside them and wrapping her arms around Jacob's waist. "She'll have the best of both of us. She'll be strong and kind, brave and gentle, wild and wise." March brought the first signs of spring. The snow began to melt, creating rushing streams and waterfalls down the mountainside. The passes started to clear, and one bright morning they heard the sound of horses approaching the cabin. Jacob grabbed his rifle instinctively, motioning for Sarah to take Dawn and move away from the door. But when he looked out the window, he recognized Dr. Morrison on his bay mare, along with two other people Jacob knew from town. He opened the door to find Morrison smiling broadly, along with Martha Jenkins, the town's unofficial midwife, and Samuel Cooper, who owned the general store. "We wanted to check on you folks," Morrison said, dismounting. "Make sure everyone survived the winter and see how that baby is doing." Sarah invited them in, and for the next hour the cabin was filled with friendly chatter and laughter. Martha examined Dawn and pronounced her thriving. Samuel brought news from town and a box of supplies, including some store-bought baby clothes that made Sarah tear up with gratitude. "There's more," Morrison said as they were preparing to leave. "The town's been talking, and we've decided we need a better system for emergencies in the high country. We're organizing a network of riders, people who know the mountain trails, who can get word to town quickly if there's trouble. We'd like you to be part of it, Jacob." Jacob looked at Sarah, who nodded encouragingly. "I'd be honored," he said. "Good man." Morrison clapped him on the shoulder. "We're also planning to bring a telegraph line up this way in the next year or two. Things are changing, Jacob. The frontier's getting a little less wild, a little more civilized." After their visitors left, Sarah and Jacob stood on the porch with Dawn, watching them ride away. The sun was warm on their faces, and the smell of pine and fresh earth filled the air. "Things are changing," Sarah echoed, "but some things stay the same, like how much I love you. Like how grateful I am that you rode through that storm to bring help, even though it turned out I didn't need it." "I'll always ride for you," Jacob said, putting his arm around her. "Through any storm, any darkness, you and Dawn are my whole world." "And you're ours," Sarah replied, standing on her toes to kiss him. As spring fully arrived, Jacob and Sarah made good on their plan to reach out to their neighbors. They visited the Johnson Ranch and found a family of 5, including 3 children under 10 who were delighted to meet baby Dawn. Martha Johnson and Sarah became fast friends, promising to help each other whenever needed. The McGuire family, Irish immigrants who'd come west after the potato famine, welcomed them with traditional music and stories. Patrick McGuire was a big, laughing man who reminded Jacob a bit of himself, and his wife Bridget was a skilled herbalist who taught Sarah how to make remedies from mountain plants. By summer, they'd built a network of friends throughout the high country, families who looked out for each other and came together for celebrations and emergencies. It was a different kind of community than the one Sarah had known in Boston, but it was strong and real and based on mutual respect and need. Dawn thrived through the summer, growing into a chubby, happy baby who loved being outside. Jacob would carry her in a sling Sarah had made while he did his work around the cabin, and Dawn would watch everything with wide, fascinated eyes. She saw her first deer at 4 months, her first eagle at 5 months, and helped harvest her first garden vegetables at 6 months by sitting on a blanket and chewing on a carrot while her parents worked. In July, Jacob and Sarah celebrated their 2nd wedding anniversary with a picnic by the stream that ran behind their cabin. Dawn was trying to sit up on her own now, wobbling adorably as she reached for everything around her. 2 years, Sarah said wonderingly, watching Dawn grab at the grass. "It feels like just yesterday you were carrying my bags to the schoolhouse, and it feels like we've been together forever, all at the same time." "Best 2 years of my life," Jacob said, meaning every word. "Before you, I was just existing. You made me start living again." "We saved each other," Sarah said, leaning against him. "I was so lonely in Boston, always feeling like I didn't quite fit anywhere. But here, with you in these mountains, I finally found where I belong." Dawn chose that moment to topple over onto her side, and both parents rushed to help her, laughing at themselves for being so protective. Dawn just giggled, already learning that falling down wasn't anything to cry about. August brought news from town that gave them pause. A gang of outlaws had been operating in the area, robbing stagecoaches and homesteads. The sheriff was organizing posses, and Jacob was asked to join one. "I don't like it," Sarah said that night as they lay in bed. "I don't want you going after dangerous men, Jacob. What if something happens to you?" "I can take care of myself," Jacob assured her, though he understood her fear. "And we have a responsibility to help protect our neighbors. If these men aren't stopped, they might come here, might threaten you and Dawn." Sarah was quiet for a long moment. "Promise me you'll be careful. Promise me you'll come back to us." "I promise," Jacob said, pulling her close. "Nothing could keep me from coming back to you." The posse rode out 3 days later. Jacob said goodbye to Sarah and Dawn at dawn, holding his daughter for a long moment and breathing in her baby smell, memorizing the weight of her in his arms. Sarah stood strong, though he could see the fear in her eyes. The hunt lasted 5 days. The outlaws were tracked to a canyon hideout, and in the confrontation that followed, 2 of the outlaws were killed and 3 were captured. Jacob fired his rifle only once, shooting the gun out of a man's hand when he tried to draw on the sheriff. No members of the posse were seriously injured, and Jacob returned home with a deeper appreciation for his peaceful life in the mountains. Sarah ran out to meet him when she heard Thunder's hooves, Dawn in her arms. Jacob dismounted and wrapped both of them in a crushing embrace, breathing in the scent of his wife's hair and his daughter's skin. "I was so worried," Sarah whispered against his chest. "I know. I was worried too about leaving you, about not coming back. But it's over now. The outlaws are in jail, and we're safe." That night, after Dawn was asleep, Jacob and Sarah made love with a desperate intensity, reaffirming their connection and their commitment to each other. Afterward, as they lay tangled together, Sarah traced the line of Jacob's jaw with her finger. "No more posses," she said. "Please, I know it's selfish, but I can't bear the thought of losing you. Dawn needs her father. I need my husband." "No more pauses," Jacob agreed. "Unless they come after our home directly, I'll let other men do the fighting. My place is here with you." September brought Dawn's first birthday, celebrated with their new network of mountain families. The Johnsons and McGuires all made the journey to their cabin, along with Dr. Morrison and his wife, Martha Jenkins, and several other families Jacob and Sarah had befriended over the past months. It was a joyous day filled with food and music and laughter. Dawn, wearing a white dress Sarah had sewn with painstaking care, was passed from lap to lap, soaking up the attention with delighted giggles. She'd learned to clap her hands the week before, and she demonstrated this new skill for everyone who would watch. Jacob had made her a wooden rocking horse, carved and sanded until it was smooth as silk, and when Dawn saw it, her face lit up with pure joy. She couldn't ride it yet, but she loved running her hands over the carved mane and making it rock back and forth. "You did good, Thornton," Patrick McGuire said, clapping Jacob on the back with a force that would have staggered a smaller man. "Beautiful wife, beautiful daughter, beautiful life. You're a lucky man." "I know it," Jacob replied, watching Sarah laugh at something Bridget was saying while Dawn sat on her lap. "Believe me, I know it." As fall arrived and the aspen trees turned gold on the mountainside, Jacob and Sarah found themselves talking more and more about the future. Dawn was walking now, toddling around the cabin with determined steps and an explorer's heart. She was fearless, investigating everything and keeping up with her required both parents' full attention. "I think it's time to expand the cabin," Jacob said one evening as they watched Dawn try to climb onto a chair. "She's going to need her own room soon, and we could use more space for storage. And maybe," Sarah said carefully, "more space for another baby someday?" Jacob turned to look at her, hope and joy blooming in his chest. "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" "Not yet," Sarah clarified with a smile. "But maybe soon. Dawn's getting bigger, and I think I'd like her to have a brother or sister. Not too close in age, but close enough that they can grow up together." "I'd like that too," Jacob said, pulling her close. "A house full of children, growing up wild and free in these mountains." They spent the rest of fall planning the expansion. Jacob would add 2 more rooms to the cabin, one for Dawn and one that could serve as either a guest room or a nursery in the future. He'd also build a larger barn and a smokehouse for preserving meat. Winter came again, their second with Dawn, and it was gentler than the previous year. They had their network of friends now, people who checked on them regularly and who they checked on in return. The isolation that had nearly been disastrous the year before was now just a comfortable privacy. Dawn experienced her first real snow this year, old enough now to understand and appreciate it. Jacob bundled her in warm clothes and took her outside, laughing as she tried to catch snowflakes on her tongue and made tiny handprints in the white powder. She loved it all, the cold and the snow and the way the world looked like a fairy tale. Christmas was magical with a 1-year-old. Dawn was fascinated by everything, from the pine boughs Sarah used to decorate the cabin to the candles Jacob lit on Christmas Eve. They sang carols, and Dawn tried to sing along in her own babbling language. Jacob gave Sarah a locket with a tiny curl of Dawn's hair inside, and Sarah gave Jacob a new leather journal for recording their family's history. "I want to write it all down," Sarah explained. "Every important moment, every milestone. So when we're old and gray, we can read it and remember exactly how we felt right now." "You write it," Jacob said. "You have a way with words I never did." So Sarah began keeping a family journal, writing by lamplight after Dawn was asleep, recording the story of their life together. She wrote about the day they met, their courtship and marriage, the night Jacob rode for the doctor while Dawn decided to arrive on her own. She wrote about their first year as parents, the challenges and joys, the way their love had deepened and grown. Spring of 1878 arrived with warm winds and blooming wildflowers. Dawn was 18 months old now, talking in short sentences and running everywhere on sturdy legs. She loved helping her father with chores, carrying small pieces of wood for the fire, or collecting eggs from the chickens Jacob had bought the previous fall. In April, Sarah told Jacob she was pregnant again. They were sitting on the porch, watching Dawn chase butterflies when Sarah took his hand and placed it on her still flat stomach. "There's another Thornton growing in here," she said softly. "Due in December, if I'm calculating correctly." Jacob felt the now familiar rush of joy and terror. "December, that's winter again. Sarah, we should go to Denver well before your time. Stay there until after the baby comes." "We'll see," Sarah said. "I was thinking maybe we could ask Martha Jenkins to come stay with us starting in November. She's delivered dozens of babies, and with the cabin expansion done, we'll have room for her. That way I won't be alone if you need to ride for Dr. Morrison again." It was a good compromise, and Jacob agreed readily. The thought of Sarah going through another birth alone still haunted his nightmares, even though she and Dawn had both been fine. Summer passed in a blur of activity. Jacob finished the cabin expansion just as Sarah began to show, and Dawn loved her new room even though she often ended up climbing into her parents' bed in the middle of the night. She was going to be a big sister, they told her, and while she didn't fully understand, she seemed excited about the idea of a baby. As fall arrived and Sarah's belly grew round, they made plans for the coming birth. Martha Jenkins agreed to come stay with them from mid-November through January, and Dr. Morrison promised to check on them regularly as long as the passes stayed clear. "We're better prepared this time," Sarah said one October evening, her hand resting on her swollen stomach. "We know what to expect. We have help lined up, and we have Dawn, proof that we can do this, that we can bring a healthy baby into the world even in challenging circumstances." "You were incredible last time," Jacob said, kneeling beside her chair and resting his head against her belly. "But I'm glad we won't have to repeat that experience exactly. I aged 10 years that night." The baby kicked against his cheek, and both parents laughed. This baby was much more active than Dawn had been, constantly moving and kicking. "I think this one's going to be a handful," Sarah predicted. She was right. Their son arrived on a snowy December night in 1878, 3 days before Christmas. But this time, Martha Jenkins was there to help, and Dr. Morrison arrived 2 hours before the baby was born, and Jacob was able to hold Sarah's hand through the whole ordeal instead of riding desperately through the darkness. Thomas Jacob Thornton came into the world screaming his displeasure at the cold and the light and the general unfairness of being born. He was bigger than Dawn had been, with a shock of dark hair and lungs that could probably be heard in the next county. "He's perfect," Jacob said, holding his son for the first time while Sarah rested, and Dawn, now 2 years old, peered at her new brother with fascinated eyes. "Baby?" Dawn asked, reaching out one careful finger to touch Thomas's hand. "Yes, sweetheart. This is your baby brother. You have to help Mama and Papa take care of him." Dawn nodded seriously, taking her new responsibility with the gravity only a 2-year-old could muster. "I help." And help she did. Dawn became Thomas's fierce protector, alerting her parents whenever he cried and bringing him toys when he was fussy. She'd sit beside his cradle and sing him the song Sarah sang to her, her little voice sweet and pure. The years that followed were full and rich. Jacob's reputation as a skilled tracker and hunter grew, and he began guiding wealthy hunters from back east through the mountains in summer and fall, bringing in good money that he saved for his children's future. Sarah started teaching Dawn her letters and numbers, preparing her for eventual formal schooling, and she held reading sessions for the children of nearby families once a week. Thomas grew into a rambunctious toddler who seemed to fear nothing, climbing everything in sight and giving his parents constant heart attacks. Dawn became his shadow and his guardian, always making sure her little brother didn't hurt himself too badly. In 1880, Sarah gave birth to their third child, a daughter they named Grace. She arrived in June, during the height of summer, making for a much easier delivery than either of her siblings. Grace was a calm baby, content to watch the world with solemn blue eyes, and she brought a different kind of joy to the family. The cabin that had once seemed so large now felt cozy and full of life. Jacob built bunk beds for the children and expanded the cabin yet again, adding a real dining room and a study where Sarah could teach and Jacob could plan his guiding expeditions. By 1882, when Dawn was 7, Thomas was 4, and Grace was 2, the Thornton family was well established in the high country. They'd become a central part of the mountain community, hosting gatherings at their cabin and helping their neighbors through emergencies and celebrations alike. One summer evening, as Jacob and Sarah sat on their porch watching their 3 children play in the meadow behind the cabin, Sarah leaned her head on Jacob's shoulder with a contented sigh. "Do you ever think about that first night?" she asked. "When you rode through the storm to fetch Dr. Morrison?" "All the time," Jacob admitted. "I was so terrified. I've never been that scared before or since." "I was terrified too," Sarah said. "But I was also so sure that you'd do everything you could, that you'd move mountains if you had to. That's who you are, Jacob. You're the man who rides through storms for the people you love. And you're the woman who brings babies into the world on her own when she has to," Jacob countered. "You're the bravest person I've ever known." They sat in comfortable silence, watching Dawn show Thomas and Grace how to make flower chains, her patient teaching voice carrying across the meadow. She was so much like Sarah, Jacob thought, smart and kind and brave. Thomas was all energy and mischief, already showing signs of inheriting his father's love for the wilderness. And Grace was still too young to know who she'd become, but she watched everything with intelligent eyes and seemed to miss nothing. "We made something good here," Sarah said softly, "something worth all the challenges and fears, a family, a home, a life full of love." "We did," Jacob agreed, pulling her closer. "And I'd do it all again in a heartbeat, every struggle, every worry, every desperate midnight ride, because it all led to this." As the sun set behind the mountain peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink and purple, Jacob Thornton counted his blessings. He had his wife, the love of his life, still as beautiful to him as the day he'd first seen her standing outside the general store. He had his children, healthy and happy and growing like wildflowers. He had his home, built with his own hands, filled with laughter and love. He had his mountains, wild and free, teaching his children the same lessons they'd taught him about strength and survival and respect for nature. The years continued to pass in a rhythm of seasons and celebrations. Dawn started formal schooling in Cedar Ridge when she turned 8, riding down the mountain with Jacob 3 times a week. She was bright and eager to learn, inheriting her mother's love of books and education. Thomas started school when he turned 6, though he was less enthusiastic about being confined indoors when there was so much world to explore outside. Grace proved to be the artist of the family, drawing everything she saw with whatever materials she could find. Sarah ordered proper art supplies from Denver, and Grace's drawings began to decorate every wall of the cabin. In 1885, when Dawn was 10, She asked her father about the night she was born. Jacob told her the whole story, sitting by the fire after her siblings were asleep, with Sarah adding her perspective. "So you weren't even there when I was born?" Dawn asked, trying to understand. "I was riding as fast as I could to bring help," Jacob explained. "But your mother is the strongest person I know, and she brought you into this world all by herself. By the time I got home with the doctor, you were already here, crying loud enough to wake the whole mountain." "Was I really born at dawn?" "Just as the sun came up," Sarah confirmed. "That's why we named you Dawn. You came with the light, bringing hope and joy after a long, dark night." Dawn considered this, her young face serious. "I'm glad you both were brave. I'm glad you rode through the storm, Papa, even though you didn't get back in time. And I'm glad you were strong, Mama. I want to be brave and strong like both of you." "You already are," Jacob assured her, ruffling her dark hair. "You're exactly who you're meant to be." Thomas, overhearing from where he was supposed to be sleeping, called out, "Tell the story of when I was born." So they did, telling how Thomas had arrived during a snowstorm, but with the doctor and Martha Jenkins present, and how he'd screamed so loud he'd scared the horses. And then Grace wanted to hear about her birth, which had been peaceful and easy, arriving in summer sunshine with birds singing outside the cabin windows. "We're a family of strong beginnings," Sarah said as she tucked all 3 children into their beds. "Each of you came into this world in your own way, and each of you is perfect exactly as you are." The children grew and changed, but the core of the family remained constant. Jacob and Sarah's love continued to deepen with each passing year, tested and strengthened by the challenges of raising children in the high country. They had hard times, of course. Winters when supplies ran low, illnesses that frightened them, accidents that could have been disasters. But they faced everything together, and they had their community to support them. In 1887, when Dawn was 12 and beginning to show the promise of the woman she'd become, Jacob began teaching her the skills she'd need to survive in the mountains. She learned to track and hunt, to read weather signs and find water. She learned which plants were edible and which were poison, how to start a fire in the rain, and how to build a shelter from branches and pine boughs. Thomas learned alongside his sister, though he was still young and easily distracted. Grace preferred to stay with her mother, learning to cook and sew and garden, but even she knew the basics of mountain survival. "I want them to be prepared for anything," Jacob explained to Sarah one night, "not because I think they'll need to survive alone in the wilderness, but because knowing they can gives them confidence, and because this land is part of who they are. It's their heritage." "They're lucky to have you teaching them," Sarah said. "Not every child gets to grow up with such a knowledgeable father." "They're lucky to have you teaching them too," Jacob countered. "Dawn reads at a level 3 years above her age. Thomas is finally starting to appreciate books thanks to your patience, and Grace writes poetry that makes me want to cry." They sat together on the porch, as they did most evenings, watching the stars come out over the mountains. 20 years had passed since they'd first met. 20 years of love and life and building something beautiful together. "Do you ever regret leaving Boston?" Jacob asked suddenly. "Giving up your teaching career to live in a cabin in the middle of nowhere?" "Never," Sarah said firmly. "Not for a single moment. This is exactly where I'm meant to be. With you, with our children, in these mountains. This is my home, Jacob. You are my home." "You're mine too," Jacob said, pulling her close. "You always will be." The 1890s arrived, bringing changes to the high country. The railroad pushed farther into the mountains, opening up new opportunities for commerce and travel. Cedar Ridge grew from a small town to a thriving community with a real school, a bank, and even a small newspaper. Jacob's guiding business flourished as more wealthy tourists came west seeking adventure. Dawn turned 16 in 1891, a beautiful young woman with her mother's grace and her father's strength. She had suitors already, young men from town who found reasons to visit the Thornton cabin, but Dawn wasn't interested in settling down. She wanted to go to college, to become a teacher like her mother had been. "I want to make a difference," she told her parents. "I want to bring education to places that need it, just like Mama did when she came here." Jacob and Sarah supported her dreams, saving money to send her to a teaching college in Denver. It was hard to think about her leaving, but they were proud of the woman she'd become. Thomas, at 13, had decided he wanted to be a veterinarian. He loved animals with a passion that bordered on obsession, nursing injured birds back to health and befriending every stray dog and cat that wandered near the cabin. Grace, at 11, was still exploring her artistic talents and dreaming of studying art in a real city someday. "Our children are going to leave us," Sarah said wistfully one autumn evening in 1892. "They're going to go out into the world and make their own lives." "That's what we raised them to do," Jacob reminded her gently. "To be strong and capable and ready to chase their dreams. We'll miss them terribly, but we'll always have each other." "And they'll come back," Sarah said with more confidence. "These mountains are in their blood. They'll leave, but they'll return. I'm sure of it." She was right. Dawn left for college in Denver in 1893, and while she thrived in the city and loved her studies, she came home every summer and winter break. Thomas followed in 1896, heading to veterinary school in St. Louis, and he too returned whenever he could. Grace, the youngest, stayed home the longest, but eventually she too left to study art in San Francisco in 1898. Jacob and Sarah, suddenly empty nesters after 23 years of children in the house, found themselves rediscovering each other. They took long walks through the mountains, revisiting the places they'd courted. They sat up late talking about their dreams and memories. They made love with the freedom and passion of newlyweds, no longer worried about children overhearing. "It's like we've come full circle," Sarah said one morning, lying in Jacob's arms as the sun streamed through their bedroom window. "Back to just the two of us, the way we started. Except we're older and grayer and wiser," Jacob said with a laugh, running his fingers through Sarah's hair, which now had silver threads running through the dark. "Speak for yourself," Sarah teased. "I'm not that much grayer." "You're still the most beautiful woman I've ever seen," Jacob said seriously. "More beautiful now than the day I met you, because now I know everything about you. All your strength and courage and kindness, that makes you radiant." The years continued their steady march. The turn of the century came in 1900, celebrated with all their neighbors gathering at the Thornton cabin for a party that lasted well into the night. Dawn came home from Denver, where she was now teaching at a school for immigrant children. Thomas came from St. Louis, already establishing a reputation as a skilled veterinarian, and Grace came from San Francisco, her portfolio full of stunning landscape paintings that captured the beauty of the West. The children were adults now, with their own lives and dreams, but they still loved their parents and the home they'd grown up in. They brought stories of the wider world, of electricity and automobiles and telephones, marvels that seemed like magic to Jacob and Sarah. "The world is changing so fast," Sarah marveled. "When I came here in 1875, it was still the frontier. Now it's the 20th century, and everything is different." "Not everything," Jacob said, taking her hand. "We're still here, still in love, still in these mountains. Some things don't change." In 1901, Dawn announced her engagement to a fellow teacher named Michael O'Brien, a kind man with Irish roots and a passion for education that matched her own. They were married that summer in a ceremony held in the meadow behind the Thornton cabin, with half the county in attendance. Jacob walked his daughter down the makeshift aisle with tears in his eyes, remembering the tiny baby he'd held at dawn 26 years earlier, the little girl who'd followed him everywhere, the young woman who'd made him so proud. "Take care of her," he told Michael, shaking the younger man's hand. "I will, sir, I promise," Michael replied, and Jacob believed him. Thomas married a year later to a rancher's daughter named Amelia, who loved animals as much as he did. They settled in Cedar Ridge, where Thomas opened a veterinary practice, finally bringing professional animal care to the high country. Grace was the last to marry, choosing a fellow artist named William, who understood her need to create and supported her dreams. They lived in San Francisco but visited often, and Grace's paintings of the Colorado mountains became famous, hanging in galleries across the country. By 1905, Jacob and Sarah were grandparents multiple times over. Dawn had 2 children, Thomas had 3, and Grace had 1 with another on the way. The cabin that had once been so empty was now constantly filled with visiting children and grandchildren, bringing joy and chaos in equal measure. Jacob, now 63 but still strong and capable, taught his grandchildren the same skills he'd taught his own children. How to track and hunt, how to respect the wilderness, how to find beauty in the harsh realities of mountain life. Sarah, at 57, still beautiful and full of life, taught them to read and write and appreciate art and music and poetry. "We've built something that will last," Sarah said one evening as they watched their grandchildren play in the meadow. "Not just a family, but a legacy. These children will remember us and teach their children about us. We'll live on through them." "That's because you were brave enough to come west," Jacob said, "and I was lucky enough to be carrying supplies the day you arrived." "And brave enough to ride through a storm when I needed you most," Sarah added, "even though you arrived too late." "I'll never regret that ride," Jacob said, "even though Dawn was already born by the time I got back, because it showed me what I was capable of. It showed me that there's nothing I wouldn't do for you, no distance I wouldn't travel, no obstacle I wouldn't face." "You've proven that every day for 30 years, Sarah said, leaning against him. "Not just that one night. Every day you've shown me love and devotion and partnership. That's real courage, Jacob, not one desperate ride, but a lifetime of showing up, of choosing us, of building this life we have." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun set and the evening stars began to appear. Their grandchildren's laughter echoed across the meadow. Inside the cabin, one of their children was making dinner while another told stories. The air smelled of pine and wood smoke and the promise of autumn. This was the life they'd built together. From a chance meeting in a frontier town, to a desperate midnight ride to a birth at dawn, through years of love and struggle and joy, they'd created something beautiful and lasting. 3 children who'd grown into remarkable adults, 7 grandchildren so far, with more likely to come. A home in the mountains they both loved, a community they'd helped build and strengthen. "I love you," Jacob said, as he'd said 1,000 times before and would say 1,000 times more. "I love you too," Sarah replied, as she always did, and always would. The mountains stood eternal around them, witnesses to their story, guardians of their legacy. And in the cabin where their daughter had been born at dawn 29 years earlier, after Jacob had ridden through the night to fetch the doctor he didn't arrive in time to need, the next generation of Thorntons was already dreaming of their own adventures, their own love stories, their own legacies to build. The years continued to unfold with grace and beauty. Jacob and Sarah grew older together, their love deepening with each passing season. They celebrated their 35th wedding anniversary in 1910, surrounded by their entire family. Dawn and Michael had 4 children now. Thomas and Amelia had 5. Grace and William had 3. The Thornton family had grown into a small army of love. Jacob, now 68, moved a bit slower than he used to, but he was still strong and capable. His hair was completely silver now, as was his beard, but his gray eyes were still sharp and clear. Sarah, at 62, had aged beautifully, her face lined with years of laughter and love, her dark hair now white as snow, but still thick and lovely. They still lived in the cabin, though it had been expanded and modernized over the years. They had electricity now, brought up by the new power lines, and a telephone that connected them to the outside world. But the heart of the cabin remained the same, the original room where Dawn had been born, where Jacob and Sarah had spent their first years of marriage. In the spring of 1912, as Jacob and Sarah sat on their porch watching the snow melt and the first wildflowers bloom, Sarah took Jacob's hand and smiled at him. "Do you know what I was thinking about this morning?" she asked. "Edith, tell me." "That night, the night Dawn was born. How terrified I was when I realized you wouldn't make it back in time. How I prayed and cried and fought to bring her into the world safely. And how when you finally came home, when I saw your face in the doorway, I knew that everything was going to be all right." "You did it all yourself," Jacob said. "I rode through that storm, pushed thunder harder than I should have, and arrived just in time to find out I wasn't needed at all." "You were needed," Sarah corrected gently. "Maybe not for the birth itself, but I needed to know you were trying. I needed to know you'd do anything to help us. That gave me strength, Jacob. Knowing you were out there, fighting through the darkness to bring help, that kept me going." "We've had a good life," Jacob said, emotion thick in his voice. "The best life," Sarah agreed, "full of love and family and adventure. I wouldn't change a single thing." That summer, the entire family gathered at the cabin for a reunion. All 3 of Jacob and Sarah's children, all 12 grandchildren, and a few great-grandchildren who were just babies. The cabin overflowed with people, and tents were set up in the meadow to accommodate everyone. On the final night of the reunion, as the sun set over the mountains in a blaze of glory, the whole family gathered around a bonfire. The children asked for stories, as children always do, and Jacob and Sarah found themselves telling the tale they'd told so many times before. "Your grandmother and I met in the spring of 1875, Jacob began, his deep voice carrying easily in the mountain air. "She just arrived in Cedar Ridge to be the new school teacher, and I was a rough mountain man who barely spoke to anyone. But the moment I saw her, I knew my life was about to change." Sarah picked up the story, describing their courtship and marriage, making her grandchildren laugh with tales of Jacob's awkward attempts at romance and her own fears about living in the wilderness. Then came the part the family loved most, the dramatic story of Dawn's birth. Jacob described the desperate ride through the storm, the fear and determination that drove him through the darkness. Sarah described the pain and terror of labor and the strength she found to bring Dawn into the world alone. "At divorce, and when Papa finally got home with the doctor," Dawn added, now a 41-year-old woman with children of her own, "I was already there, crying my lungs out and making sure everyone knew I had arrived." The family laughed, and the children begged for more stories. So Thomas told about his own birth, and Grace told about hers, and then the grandchildren shared their memories, building a tapestry of family history that stretched from 1875 to 1912, 37 years of love and life in the Colorado mountains. As the fire burned down to embers and the children began to yawn, Jacob looked around at the faces of his family, illuminated by the dying firelight and the rising moon. This was his legacy. These people, connected by blood and love, carrying forward the values he and Sarah had tried to instill: courage and kindness, strength and gentleness, respect for the land and for each other. "Thank you," he said suddenly, his voice rough with emotion. "For what, Papa?" Dawn asked. "For this. All of this. For being exactly who you are. For building good lives and raising good children. For making me proud every single day." Sarah squeezed his hand, her eyes bright with tears. "We're proud of all of you too. You've taken what we started and made it into something even more beautiful." The summer stars wheeled overhead, the same stars that had witnessed Jacob's desperate ride through the darkness 36 years earlier. The mountains stood silent and eternal, as they always had and always would. And in the heart of the Colorado wilderness, surrounded by the family they'd built together, Jacob and Sarah Thornton held each other close and counted their blessings. The reunion ended, and the family dispersed back to their own lives and homes. But they'd all return, again and again, drawn back to the cabin in the mountains where it all began, where a mountain man and a school teacher had fallen in love, where babies had been born and children had grown, where a legacy had been forged through courage and commitment and abiding love. Jacob and Sarah lived many more years together, growing old in the home they'd built, surrounded by the mountains they loved and the family they'd created. They saw their grandchildren grow and marry, met great-grandchildren, and even a few great-great-grandchildren. They witnessed the world change in ways they never could have imagined, but through it all, their love remained constant and true. And when they finally passed, years later and peacefully in their sleep, within days of each other because neither could bear to be without the other for long, they were buried in the meadow behind their cabin under the aspen trees that turned gold every fall, overlooking the mountains that had been their home and their sanctuary. Their descendants continued to gather there, year after year, telling the stories and keeping the memories alive. The story of how Jacob rode through the night to fetch the doctor, how Sarah brought Dawn into the world, at dawn in the cabin they'd built with love. The story of a mountain man and a school teacher who found each other against all odds and built something beautiful that would last for generations. And in the quiet moments, when the wind whispered through the pines and the sun set over the peaks in shades of gold and crimson, those who listened carefully could almost hear the echoes of the past, the sound of a baby's first cry at dawn, the thunder of horses' hooves racing through a storm, the laughter of children playing in a mountain meadow, the voices of two people saying, "I love you," with the certainty and devotion that only comes from a lifetime of choosing each other, again and again and again. This was their story, the story of Jacob and Sarah Thornton, a love story written in the wild mountains of Colorado, begun with a desperate ride through the darkness and a birth at dawn, continued through decades of joy and struggle, and ending only when death itself could no longer keep them apart. It was a story of courage and commitment, of strength and gentleness, of two people who found each other in the vast wilderness and built a love that would echo through the generations long after they were gone. And high in the Colorado mountains, in a cabin that had been expanded and modernized but never forgotten, in a meadow where wildflowers bloomed every spring and aspen trees turned gold every fall, their legacy lived on, as enduring and eternal as the mountains themselves.